2010s in the NBA was an insane decade for trades, which I've talked about before, but what about the worst of the worst? What about the truly terrible, awful, comically bad trades of this decade? What happened to the worst NBA trades of the 2010s? First up is one of the most mind-boggling NBA trades of all time from 2011. So at the time, the LA Clippers are just straight up bad, and they've been bad for a few seasons. They had young Blake Griffin, Eric Gordon was there, but they weren't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. So if you're in that situation, you're a young team, you're not very good, on your way to one of the worst records in the league, what's the one thing that's most important to you as a franchise? Your first round pick. That thing is your reward for being terrible. It's the best way for you to not be terrible at some point soon. It's the most valuable asset you have. But instead, the Clippers in the middle of the season, when they knew they were bad, used their first round pick unprotected to dump the salary of Baron Davis to Cleveland. Davis had a few years left on an expensive deal, and the Cavs were rebuilding from LeBron leaving the first time, so they were fine just getting an asset, but that is a crazy high price to pay if you're the Clippers. As it turns out, the pick of course was a high selection going into the lottery, and then it got even worse as they moved up to the #1 pick in the draft, which the Cavs used to select Kyrie Irving. The Clippers traded away Kyrie Irving to dump 2 years of Baron Davis's contract. Now, to be fair for the Clippers, in the 2011 offseason, they traded for Chris Paul and then they became contenders, but this is just an obnoxiously bad trade regardless, and it actually brings up some really interesting what ifs in terms of what happens if the Clippers don't make this deal. Do they keep Kyrie and not trade for Paul? Do they move Kyrie in the Paul trade and he gets to play with Anthony Davis? There's a lot of interesting possibilities there. But if you thought that would be the only entry in which a bad team traded their first round pick mid-season, you would be wrong, because now we get to the 2012 New Jersey Nets. They were also bad but wanted to be good. They had Darren Williams, Brook Lopez, who was hurt at the time, and were pretty soon going to make a different terrible trade, going all in for Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, which only isn't mentioned in this video because I covered it in a different video on this decade. So it's March 2012. At the trade deadline, the Nets are 15-29, easily one of the worst records in the league. And just like the Clippers, you'd assume that they would like to keep their first round pick. Nope. They traded their first top 3 protected to the Trailblazers for Gerald Wallace to add him to Williams and Lopez and start to build a competitive team. The only problem was Wallace was on the decline and his contract expired in a few months. At the time, the GM of the Nets said that they only really liked 3 players in the upcoming 2012 draft anyway, so they felt comfortable trading away the pick, which is like the worst logic ever. As it turns out, that pick landed at 6th overall, and the Trailblazers selected Damian Lillard. Meanwhile, the Nets re-signed Wallace to a massive contract, and he just wasn't very good at all. Trading a first-round pick when you're 14 games under 500 for a guy that isn't an all-star on an expiring contract, and that pick becoming Damian Lillard, is about as bad as it gets. Really quick though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Comet by Perplexity. Comet is an AI-powered browser that is built to help you, not just by giving you answers, but by actually taking actions. It can send messages, it can do research, and much, much more. So for example, if you're watching this video and you're a student with a busy schedule and you need help organizing that schedule while also researching for a paper while also filling out applications, Comet can help with that all within an adless, distraction-free experience. And for me, by far, the biggest thing is the organizational aspect of Comet. I have a lot of stuff going on in my life, a lot of things to schedule and keep track of, and frankly, I'm just not good at organization. I never really have been. So the fact that Comet doesn't just give me answers, but actually helps me organize my busy schedule is a huge help. And I'm someone that can get overwhelmed extremely quickly. I am not a 100 tabs open in my browser person at all. That really bothers me. So the fact that Comet is an all-in-one solution, there's no multiple tabs, I don't have to jump around, I don't have to keep track of all these different things on my screen, is a huge help. So if you're looking for an ad-free, all-in-one, AI-powered browser to help you with all these different tasks, go ahead and check out Comet. I encourage you to download the Comet browser for free by clicking the link in the description. Give it a try, and thank you again to Comet by Perplexity for sponsoring this video. Next up is maybe the worst trade on the entire list, also from 2012. At the time of this trade, the Oklahoma City Thunder had just made the NBA Finals. All of Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, and James Harden weren't even in their prime yet. They were competitive in the finals, and every single team in the league was terrified of what they would become. But strangely, Game 5 of the 2012 NBA Finals will be the last game that Harden, Westbrook, and Durant ever played together. In October, as we were heading into into the season, the Thunder traded Harden to the Rockets for Jeremy Lamb, Kevin Martin, 2 first-round picks, and a second-round pick. To be clear, Harden was the 6th man on those OKC teams, and nobody thought that he would eventually become an MVP, but he was clearly really good, and the Thunder basically just gave up on him. Now, there are multiple angles that make this such a terrible trade. One, giving up on a young core of those 3 guys should just never happen. It isn't like they were struggling to find success. They had just made the finals. 2, the Thunder got terrible value here. Martin was fine for a season and then was gone. Lamb never developed. One of the first-round picks became Mitch McGary, who did nothing, and the other became Steven Adams, who, yes, was good, but not James Harden level good. Basically swapping Harden for Adams right in the middle of an era that should have just been Durant, Westbrook, and Harden dominating the league for the next few years is an absolutely brutal outcome. The reasons for the trade over the years have been debated, but there are a few reasons that this happened. First, it was partly a money thing, as the Thunder and Harden were trying to work out a contract extension, and he wanted more money than OKC was willing to give him, partly because they wanted to avoid the luxury tax and an even higher payroll, with Westbrook, Durant, and Serge Ibaka already there. But more importantly, I just think that the Thunder liked the trade. I think they were a little bit lower on Harden than we all realized at the time, and felt like Martin could take his spot on the team while also getting other assets to fill out the roster. They of course were completely wrong, but that seemed to be the mindset, and what followed was basically the end of the Durant and Westbrook era. Next up now, we stay in 2012 in what was clearly a terrible year for NBA trades. This was the summer of the LA Lakers super team. After failing to acquire Chris Paul the year before, they made some massive roster changes, including bringing in Dwight Howard, and along with that deal, they made a move for Steve Nash. They sent 2 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks to Phoenix in exchange for the 37-year-old former MVP, a statement that now obviously feels like a terrible decision. To be fair, he was still really good at the time, but it felt like the Lakers were just trying to add as much star power as possible without really thinking about the construction of the team. To make things worse, Nash had back issues that caused him to never really be healthy in LA, and he provided almost nothing for them for 2 seasons, especially when you consider the draft compensation that they traded away. Fortunately for the Lakers, 3 of the picks ended up being basically nothing, but the 2018 first-round pick that they traded away in the deal would eventually become Mikal Bridges after the pick was swapped around between a handful of teams. Given how good he has become, a straight-up swap of 2 years of bad Steve Nash for Mikal Bridges, who not that much longer later after being drafted was a centerpiece of a Kevin Durant trade, makes this not only a terrible trade, but one of the most overlooked bad trades of the decade. Moving on now to another trade that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. In December 2014, the Dallas Mavericks were a good, solid team. They were a few years removed from winning the title in 2011, had rebuilt the roster a bit, and wanted to go for one more run with Dirk still being really, really good. So they went out and made a big move for a player that they thought was still a star, Rajon Rondo. When you look at that Mavs team, they definitely needed some help, as it was Dirk and then Monte Ellis, Chandler Parsons, Tyson Chandler was back, but they needed an upgrade in the backcourt. So they sent some contracts, most notably Jay Crowder, who developed into a good role player, and a first-round pick to Boston for Rondo, and a lot of people really liked the trade at the time. Some even thought that it made the Mavs contenders. It wasn't a perfect fit, but it was a talent upgrade. The problem was Rondo and head coach Rick Carlisle did not get along at all, and the move was a disaster pretty much immediately. They still managed to win 50 games, but Rondo played in just 2 of the playoff games and basically quit on the team in the middle of the year, completely derailing what was an otherwise pretty promising Mavs season. That offseason, Rondo left in free agency, so the Mavs traded away some solid pieces and draft compensation for half a season of a guy that was actively upset with the team. Not an ideal midseason trade at all. For the Celtics, the first-round pick ended up being nothing, but Jay Crowder was good and was also a part of the eventual Kyrie Irving deal to Cleveland as well, so considering Rondo's days as a star were over, that isn't a terrible haul. And moving on, this is a really good transition because this next trade is actually related. In the 2015 offseason, the Sacramento Kings got really weird. They traded some players, including Nick Stauskas, plus a pick swap in 2017 and a first-round pick in 2019 to the Sixers for nothing. Now, to be fair, they did this deal to clear cap space that offseason, but that is a massive amount of stuff to trade just for cap space. Stauskas was a top 10 pick the year before, so they basically traded 2 firsts and a swap just to dump some salary. And immediately, everybody hated the deal. It was hilariously bad. Granted, Stauskas wasn't very good as a rookie, and he nor any of the other players that were dumped ended up being anything for Philadelphia or elsewhere, but that pick swap in 2017 allowed the Sixers to swap picks from 5 to 3, and then they used the extra first that they got from the Kings to move up to first overall and select Markelle Fultz. Now, Fultz wasn't good in Philly, but essentially the Kings traded away the draft capital necessary to trade up to the first pick in the draft just in exchange for cap space. Not to mention that if they hadn't done the pick swap, they would have been picking at 3, free and could have ended up with someone like Jason Tatum. Realistically, that wasn't going to happen because if Danny Ainge didn't trade out of the first pick, he was going to take Tatum first overall. He wasn't leaving that draft without Jason Tatum, but still, the Kings technically traded away the pick that became Jason Tatum just for cap space. But how is all of this related to the Rondo trade? Well, the player the Kings were opening up cap space for was Rajon Rondo, the guy that just quit on the Dallas Mavericks. This made no sense at the time and still doesn't, and it's hilarious that in a span of a few months, the Celtics dumped Rondo for stuff. Rondo hated Dallas, so they didn't re-sign him, which means that the Kings want him, and then they trade stuff to Philly to get cap space, and then Philly uses that stuff a few years later to move up from 5 to 3 to 1 in the 2017 draft, and in the end, they take Markelle Fultz while the Celtics get Tatum and an extra first-round pick from the Sixers via the Kings. Just absolute insanity. Next up now is another super overlooked one, and it's a draft night trade. Going back to the 2017 draft, which we talked about in the previous section, the Denver Nuggets held the 13th pick. They had Jokic, Jamal Murray, a ton of other really interesting young guys, and were a team on the rise. And the player that went 13th in that draft was Donovan Mitchell, an eventual All-NBA player, great fit with the young Nuggets, but they didn't pick him. Instead, they moved back from 13 in exchange for Trey Lyles and the 24th pick in this draft, which was Tyler Lydon. Obviously, neither of those guys really mattered in comparison to Mitchell, who almost immediately became a franchise guy in Utah. Now, the nice thing for the Nuggets is they eventually made it work anyway and won the 2023 title, but this is still a massive missed opportunity for a team that was on its way to becoming a Western Conference power. Now, I'm not going to grade the Nuggets too harshly for this, one, because they won the title, and two, there are a lot of draft night trades that ended up looking really, really bad, just like there are bad draft selections in general, but this was certainly one of the worst trades of the decade. And last up now is a deal that I feel like has been completely forgotten: Blake Griffin to the Detroit Pistons. Near the trade deadline in 2018, the Pistons felt like they needed an upgrade. They were an average team in the East and needed a boost in star power, so they went to the Clippers to find it, trading for the exciting Blake Griffin, who had just signed a massive contract extension with LA, but not long after, they obviously decided to rebuild the team. Now, when I say that the Pistons needed an upgrade, what that really meant was that the coaching staff needed one. Stan Van Gundy was in charge at the time and was also in charge of roster moves, and this was clearly a trade that he hoped would save his job. Detroit sent some contracts, most notably Tobias Harris, plus a first-round pick to the Clippers in exchange for Blake. There was plenty of risk to this deal for the Pistons, considering Griffin's injury history and the big contract that he had just signed, but at first, honestly, this worked out really well for them. Once he got healthy, Griffin was amazing in the following 2018-19 season and was named third-team All-NBA. Unfortunately, things fell apart quickly after that as he hit 30 years old, and the Pistons were left with his massive contract on the books. The Clippers, meanwhile, got a lot in exchange for Blake. Tobias Harris was really good for them and eventually was moved to the Sixers in exchange for some draft assets, while the first-round pick became Miles Bridges, but the Clippers moved that pick by one spot and actually ended up with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander in the 2018 draft. So Harris, or the eventual assets for him, essentially 2 first-round picks from the Sixers, plus SGA in exchange for 1 more year of really good Blake Griffin. That is a really tough trade for the Pistons. Meanwhile, the Clippers would turn around and use those assets and SGA to add Kawhi Leonard and Paul George to the team in 2019, something that they could not have done without the stuff that they got for Blake. Just a brutal trade for the Pistons despite the little bit of success that Griffin had in Detroit. And that is what happened to the worst NBA trades of the 2010s.